Okay, was I muted? Okay, so good evening everyone, and welcome everyone to you all for this overview of organ registrations. I've had a lot of requests actually over the months gone by around, you know, how do I choose certain sounds for hymns? How do I get a continuity of crescendo, all that sort of things. And specifically, you know, what stops was I using for certain pieces? So I thought I would show you on the screen what I'm using and talk through it as well. I've got a lot of experience with organ registration from seeing people, from seeing professional people play, you know, and getting ideas from them. So I want to pass those on to you. Throughout the video, if you'd like to ask questions in the live chat, if you'd like to make requests for hymns that you'd like me to play and register, or a piece of music perhaps that you'd like me to register, we'll go through those at the very end of the video. Hopefully you saw on the screen earlier just a sort of an itinerary of pieces that were sort of an itinerary of sections that we're going to be talking about. So the first section, what we should approach is a general overview of sounds. I hope you like the glasses, by the way. Brand new, first time I've ever used them. Picked them up today, so they are quite literally brand new. So let's talk about some sounds. Okay, so there's people in the chat today who will be watching who are experts at organ registration. So some of this will be just, you know, you've known this for years, but there are some people who are just amateurs who are just coming to the organ. People who are pianists, and you know, other musicians who don't play the organ, who are interested in what these sounds are. So please excuse me if you know this already, but I'll start at the basics, and as we go through the video we'll end up talking about quite advanced crescendos and all of that sort of stuff. So let's start with these stops called the flute. A flute is quite simply a stop which mimics the sound of a flute. By the way, we are today at Rotterdam, of course. I know the organ in Rotterdam really well. And it has a wonderful array of stops. Let's have a listen to some of these flutes. So let's start with, if I go to this screen here, you can then see the stops that I'm using on the screen. How clever is that? Let's start with this stop here on the swell. I've also put the translations on the screen for you. So this is one of the quieter stops on the swell. This is one of the quieter flutes. We have another flute here. Going down to the choir. Up to the fourth manual on the solo. And finally on the grate. Okay, so we have that's an 8-foot flute. Okay, that's probably a little bit advanced for those people who don't know what an 8-foot is. It's basically piano pitch. It's the lowest stop. It's the lowest pipe on the keyboard. Is 8 foot. So bottom C is 8 feet. But I won't talk about different pitches today unless you ask me to. Okay, so that's the sound of a flute. We can bring all of those together to make a really wonderful and warm sound. Listen to this. Was all the flutes. We then have these stops called diapasons, or on this organ they're actually called prestants. They can also be called principals. They can be called montes if you're in France. It's basically all the same thing. These stops are made of wood generally. Flutes are made from metal generally. So the diapasons on this organ sound a bit like this. They're much bigger. That's the swell. Down on the choir, my favourite stop. And then finally on the grate. together. So that's the general diapason sound. Okay, so you've had flutes, diapasons, the two traditional stereotypical sound of an organ. Then we have these things called mixtures. They're really bright, really high pitched. Then we have these mutations, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. It sounds like a normal stop, but actually if I play a normal pitch, so an 8-foot flute, and add one of these mutations to it, people with a good oral perception will be able to hear that that's actually a fifth apart. So mutations are not the same pitch as what you play. They're actually either a third or a fifth apart. Okay, then we have the reeds, of course. And that is basically an organ in a nutshell. Those are all the sounds. So you have the reeds, the mutations, the very bright mixtures, the flutes, and the diapasons. We also on this organ, incidentally, have a quint, which almost it uses harmonics. If you use it with a flute, it almost sounds like a mutation. They're very common in organs outside of the UK. We don't tend to have them in this country very much, unfortunately. I'm very fond of them. So whilst talking about the general sort of the sounds of the organ, it's important to mention that when you are registering an organ, and we'll get into the nitty-gritty later, but it's important to remember that there is a different sound in wherever you are in a church or concert hall or cathedral. If you're sat at the organ console, often you're quite near the pipes, so the organ sound is very imminent, it's very clear, and can be very loud. If the congregation is further away from the pipes, it's obviously going to be much quieter. So it's actually really useful sometimes to go and hear the organ being played in the church. You know, ask someone to play your registration whilst you go and hear it down in the church to get that perspective. Because it does sound very different indeed. The organ of Westminster Cathedral, for example, is the console is right up with all the pipe work, and the great mixture is very close to the organist's head. It's very, very loud at the console, but actually down in the cathedral it's wonderfully balanced and blended. Another quirky sort of thing to look out for is even though the stops may have the same name, so I demonstrated a few flutes, a few diapasons here. The swell diapason is called a praestant, the choir diapason is called a praestant, and the great 16 equivalent is a praestant. So they're all highlighted on the screen for you now. Even though they have the same name, they don't always sound the same. Okay? And that's a really, really important thing to remember. Between the organs, you might go down the road to play another organ, and the diapason will sound entirely different. It's one of the great things about being an organist. It's finding that sitting at an organ, pulling out those stops, a flute 8-foot, and it's sounding so different to what you've heard before. The French flute harmoniques, for example, are just so beautifully voiced. Those chronicle stops are so beautiful. So that was a quick rundown of the sounds of the organ. Okay, that's the basic stuff over and done with. Now, if you've played an organ before, I think most of you probably have played an organ before, or at least seen people play like me play. You'll notice that we have more than one keyboard. We actually have 3 here, and on the real organ in Rotterdam there are of course 4 keyboards. Why do we have 3, 4, 2, sometimes 5 keyboards? They're called manuals in organ language. Well, it's really rather simple actually. It's because we have all these stops to choose. We know we have an orchestra in front of us, all of these stops, all of these sounds. And we don't always want to have them all on the same manual. If we have, we have 80 odd stops on this organ in front of us. And if we had only one keyboard, obviously we'd have to play all of those stops on one keyboard. But we don't want to do that. We want to be able to use maybe a couple of stops over here and then a few more stops over here. And we want to be able to separate them. So we can have different stops on different manuals. That's how we achieve solos. We can have a trumpet stop down on the choir, accompanied just by just some continuo style flutes on the grate. So that's why we have more than one manual, okay? But we can bring them all together, luckily, through use of couplers. Couplers is a fairly modern invention back in the days of Bach and Buxtehude in the Baroque period. Couplers weren't entirely common. Some organs had them indeed, but they weren't common. It's very uncommon common nowadays to have an organ without any couplers at all. So we can actually play. The main manual is called the grate, and it's this one here on this organ. In England, it's the second one up. And you can couple all the manuals through to the grate. So you can be very lazy. I can pull out a swell stop, and it will sound on the grate if I pull out the swell to grate coupler. Similarly, I can do the same with the choir to grate coupler. Pull out a mixture. And so on and so on. And you can also couple them all down to the pedal as well. And in different orders. You can have swell to choir. You can sometimes have grate to choir, solo to swell. You can really change them all around to your own liking. So I think that actually was a bit of waffle, but it's actually an introduction to the organ sounds, the organ, how the manuals are set up. And I think we should really get into some more nitty-gritty technical stuff. So let's start with hymn playing, the registration of hymn playing. So you've seen me playing every Sunday, virtual church for 3 hours of hymns. So you're familiar with how I do it, and I'm just going to take you through some of the things that I think are important to know. So let's just talk about first the playover. Now in virtual church, we don't tend to have a playover because there's no choir here, there's no congregation here. I guess if you're singing at home or following the words, I just trust that you'll be able to get on with it. But if we were having a playover, it's important that the playover, it tells the congregation what the tune is, it sets the tempo, and it sets the overall general mood. And we can set the overall general mood by the tempo, by the way we play it, and of course by the organ registration. It's so important. Now let's just take the first hymn that I played. I opened just with the first verse of Praise My Soul, the King of Heaven. 4 verses normally, but of course I just played the first verse. And what I used was just quite simply if you look on the screen, you can see I've got 8 and 4 diapasons here on the swell, you see, and also a bit of flute to give it some weight. 8 and 4 on the grate, had a bit of pedal as well, and then I had the choir trumpet and the quieter on Schmad reed. And it sounded like this. Now that's a fairly strong sound. It's a steady tempo, and it clearly tells people what the tune is. So as soon as everyone hears that in the church, they know it straight away. They can almost imagine what the words are without even opening the hymn book. So the playover is so important. If I wasn't going to use a solo reed for the playover, I would probably use a really just a sort of a foundation-y, strong sound. Let me just play this to you. All I have there is 8 and 4. The 4-foot stops add a bit of brightness, okay? So the 8-foot stops, as I said earlier, basically are piano pitch. And the 4-foot stops just add that little bit of brightness to it. For a playover, I don't really think you need much more than that, okay? So you need to support and lead a congregation. It's really important. The tempo needs to be the same. So for the first verse, I would probably go up to what's called the mixtures, the principal chorus plus the mixture. Of course, this depends on the organs where you are. You might have a humongous mixture and it would be entirely inappropriate to use it because it might be only used for last verses. Luckily on this organ we're spoiled for choice with mixtures, so I'll probably use the quieter great mixture. Probably add some 2-foot stops as well. And the first verse might sound like this, if I was being sensible and not getting excited in virtual church. Now let's just dig down a little deeper into what we're actually hearing here. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier on in the sort of the organ sounds, we have the flutes, diapasons, and mixtures. I'm not using any mutations at all. So let's just have a think about what we're using here. There's a school of thought, and I was actually told this as an organ student, that you shouldn't really use diapasons and flutes at the same time. Now, I think that you can use flutes and diapasons at the same time. If you consider a flute sounds like this. On this organ, it's a particularly to my ears, that's a fairly fat sounding flute. A beautiful flute, but a very wide, full-bodied flute. And yes, you could either go 8-foot flute, 4-foot flute, and then stay with the flutes on all the manuals. But you have a very sensible and clean sound. If you bring a diapason into the mix, let's just bring the swell diapason into that mix, so the 8-foot and 4-foot flutes on the great plus the swell diapason. Doesn't really get in the way at all, does it? And if anything, it adds a little bit of body to it. That's without the 4-foot flute. With the 4-foot flute. I actually do use the flutes and diapasons at the same time, because I like to have, and we'll get more into this later on in the sort of the more technical bit, but I like to have a bit of foundation and weight in my lower part of the, I'll describe it later, but in the lower part of the house, the foundation. Okay, so we have 8, 4, 2, and mixtures. We could then add the reeds to that. So the reeds on this organ and on the great are rather large. So this is the 8, 4, 2 and mixture. Very nice, pleasant, clean sound. And then we can add the trumpet into that. I think, to my ears, the great reeds are saved for the last verse. You can use the swell reeds to much greater effect, I find. This is the swell trumpet. Very nicely to the chorus. Okay, so we need to talk about solo stops in hymn playing. So, what have you got? Be still for the presence of the Lord. Perhaps that might be a nice one that we can demonstrate. So this hymn is a very quiet hymn, and we would need to use something in the left hand, which is not going to obtrude the right hand. So solos in hymn playing are quite common, but you have to bear in mind that for some solo stops, like a quiet mutation, like this sort of sound, that's quite a quiet sound, isn't it? So if there was a large congregation who were singing it, maybe as the offertory hymn, perhaps it would be an odd choice for an offertory hymn, frankly, but it might happen. It would be too quiet. If, however, it was being sung during the communion, that might be quite a nice sound to use. What would you use with that then, do you think? Well, let's try out the swell. And we gravitate towards the swell because there's a swell box there. Okay, so let's just try the quiet flute and the viol da gamba. Okay, that's a nice balance, isn't it? So that's the 8, 4, and Nazard, and on the pedal you just simply would have 16 and 8. So if you were playing, verse 1 of this, it wouldn't work. The congregation would feel unsupported and unleaded. They need to be supported and led in their singing in worship. So you could then use, as we said earlier, the trumpet, the enchimade, but you need to make sure that if you're using a tuba or something like that, it's not going to deafen everyone. So solos are absolutely fine. Word painting is really exciting. So we could, in fact, let's just have a listen to "Be Still for the Presence of the Lord." I'll just do one verse with some solos, and I'll tell you what I'm doing. So you had the clarinet for the second half, and for the first half, the 8, 4, and 2. Now you need to be careful that, as I said earlier, the volume. The clarinets are often delicately voiced. They're often not designed to lead a congregation. All right, so you might just need to consider whether it's going to lead or not. Okay, we're just going to have a quick talk about word painting now. So word painting is something that, as an English organist, as an English cathedral organist in years gone by, it's in our blood to word paint, in the psalms and in hymns. Now I've got a hymn here. It's "Let all mortal flesh keep silence," and there's some wonderful occasions, opportunities in this hymn to word paint. Verse 3, let's just have a look at verse 3. The words are towards the end of it. Well, so rank on rank, the host of heaven spreads its vanguard on the way, as the light of light descendeth from the realms of endless day, that the powers of hell may vanish as the darkness clears away. So we've got lots of light there. To my ears, a light sound, as the light of light descendeth, coming out from the heavens, needs to be out of the clouds. It's like it's rays of sun coming out of the cloud. It's bright, it's exciting, it's mixtures. And then the next sort of line, that's the powers of hell. Well, how can we get to hell? We're not going to depict hell by using just a beautiful little flute, are we? That's not hell indeed. We want some of the old grunt down there. So how do we achieve this then? Okay, so we need to go from a bright sound down to a low sound. We can use the pedals as well, because hell is all the way down there. The pedals are all the way down there as well. I'm not saying that the pedals are hell, but they are good at depicting those low rumbling fires of hell. So let's have a look at verse 3. And you can see on the screen what I'm going to use. So you had the bright mixtures and then the bit of rumbling going on, actually. You could even bring on the pedal reeds right through the whole line of that the powers of hell may vanish. So you have that 32-foot reed rumbling away. I would hesitate to advise you to do it in a church service. Your vicar might get a bit cross. Make it a bit more hellish. So let's remove the mixtures. Let's just keep the reeds on, and the so we have the foundation stops and the pedal reeds as well. And the next line is "as the darkness clears away." So you could word paint that by clearing that sound away. So a diminuendo, perhaps. I don't know. Let's try it, shall we? There's lots of things you can do. To my mind and to my sort of interpretation of these words, when you're talking about hell and fire and lightnings and hot thunderbolts and all of that sort of stuff, it's a very dark sound, and reeds are, to my ears, very dark. Okay, so we could spend an entire video talking about hymns, but I don't want to really. I want to move on. So if you have questions around hymns playing, put them in the chat and we'll address them later on. It's important actually when playing hymns. I say it's important. It's helpful, I suppose, when playing hymns, that it's helpful to have divisionals. And divisionals are these. If I change to this camera, you should be able to see the buttons under each manual. They're also called thumb pistons in this country. What you can do with these is you can program them to whatever you want. A lot of you know this already, but some people perhaps in other countries who around Europe don't necessarily have them, but we do in England. We're actually very lucky to have them. They're very useful indeed, and you can program any combination of stop that you wish on them. So these divisionals here that I'm pointing to here under the swell relates to only the swell stops. Okay, so you can program any combination of swell stops on these swell divisionals. We have swell divisionals here, great divisionals here, which also confusingly can control the pedal stops, because if you're crescendoing or changing to a loud combination of stops on the great, then presumably you also want to have a loud combination of stops on the pedal, right? And then of course the choir pistons right on the bottom. Now we tend to use these in a crescendo-like way, starting with number 1 as the quietest stops. This organ has 6 divisionals on each manual. It's common in the UK to have 8 on each one. 8 is the very common number of divisionals to find. You might go to places like Westminster Abbey, Liverpool, and you have 10. Chester has 11, which is a bit bizarre. But you can, like I say, you can program them to whatever you wish. This is how I tend to program them. So, as you can see on the screen, number 1 is the swell strings, and only the swell strings. And then you want to build on that, don't you? So number 2 would then take off the swell strings, because it's very rare actually to use the swell strings with other stops. Now what I mean by that is you wouldn't necessarily, unless the composer specifically asked for it, you wouldn't use swell strings or strings with an 8 and 4 foot flute. They sort of don't speak well, you know. It's like having a choir full of people who just don't blend together nicely. Some composers do ask for a 4 foot flute with the strings. But often the composers will be quite specific about that. So number 2 for me is an 8 and 4 foot flute. And then number 3 is 8 and 4 foot still, but over on the diapasons. Number 4 adds the 2 foot with an extra flute as well, just to add a bit of body to it. Number 5 brings on the mixture. And then number 6 brings on the full swell without the 4 foot. And it's completely down to your discretion what you use. So why I use that is swell. I often dive down to swell 1. I often want to have the swell strings. They're beautiful, and you can often start a pre-service improvisation using the strings and then crescendo up. Now, on a cathedral organ where you have more than 8, it's actually a bit easier to spread out. If you have a large organ like we have here, fitting all of those swell stops into 6 divisionals is quite challenging. And there's a bit of a, you know, a difference of opinion between organists around. It's often swell 1, 2, 3, and 4 are largely the same. You tend to go to churches, cathedrals, press those early buttons, and they're generally the same. It's when you get to the sort of the upper end where it differs. Some organists like to have, so we have on the screen now 8 and 4 diapasons. Now at this point, it's quite common when playing French music and you know, for like gradual smooth crescendo, to add an oboe to that sound, but we don't have an oboe here. The nearest thing we have, well, is the vox humana, which is not really an oboe sound, and then the trumpet, which is just huge. So at this point, you could then add the oboe. We don't have an oboe here. If we did, I probably would add the oboe. So I'm following a different route. You can either build a swell up with and then bring the reeds on first and then add the mixtures later, or build the swell up, add the mixture and then the reeds to that chorus. On this organ in Rotterdam, I bring the mixture on first and then the reeds into it. It's the way the swell reeds on this organ are particularly big. Let's compare the swell trumpet to the great trumpet. It's quite loud with the box wide open. Okay. So the full swell sound, I don't use a 4-foot because I think the mixture on this organ, this one right here, is bright enough. If I was being particularly French, I would take the mixture off and put the 4-foot on. It's a really wonderful sound, that. And then all of that together with the mixture. That, to my ears, that 4-foot really stands out. I can hear it. Unless I'm going really hell for leather. So that's basically how divisionals work, what we use them for. Okay, some organs have them, some organs don't. And in playing hymns with crescendos and word painting without divisionals is rather challenging, actually. So we are very fortunate to have all these divisionals. Okay, let's go into something a little bit more detailed now. In fact, before we do that, let's have a demo of a hymn. Let's have Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, NEH. It's 300 and something. I can't remember what it is. So I'm going to have to look in the index to find it. Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. There's a wonderful crescendo in this hymn, the final verse. And let's see how we use the divisionals and a bit of manual labour as well by pushing the stops in. Let's see how we can achieve that crescendo. What did I say? 3 what? 3, 5, 3. Okay. So this is Dear Lord and Father of Mankind, a wonderful tune by Parry, and we'll have verses 4 and 5. With verse 5, the reason I'm using this hymn as an example is verse 5 has a wonderful, spectacular crescendo. The penultimate line is, "Speak through the earthquake, wind and fire, O still small voice of calm." So you have earthquake, you have wind, and you have fire. And then all of a sudden it's "O still small voice of calm." So you have to go from one extreme to the other through the use of divisionals. So watch on the screen, watch which stops I'm using, and hopefully it will give you some ideas. So the absolute climax of that phrase is wind and fire specifically. That bit there. So your absolute full organ has to be on that particular bit. And then you have to negotiate the beautiful harmonies, the tempo and the diminuendo. There's a lot to think about. So, crescendos and diminuendos. This is one of the hardest things, and this is the sort of thing that can only be done through practice and just trial and error, really. So, as I said earlier, we have all of these different sounds, diapasons and flutes, etc. Now, when you are adding these stops together, what you are doing is you are building a foundation. You are building upon a foundation layers of sound. So, what I like to think about is when I direct choirs, I like to think about a triangle. I like to have a good foundation at the very base of the triangle. It gets wider, it's bigger, and the higher you go, the less you need, because it's wonderful to have a really rich and sonorous bass line, but you don't need to have so many sopranos because higher pitches travel easier. It's fairly similar with the organ, actually. I like to have a good foundation and then not so much on the top. But on the organ, I like to think of a house. Okay, and I'll go through this visual picture with you. So the foundation is the 16. Okay, so the pedal, 16, two 16 foots on this organ, and 32 as well, of course. So let's call that the foundation. Let's call that the concrete and the groundwork. Upon that, you then have imagine sort of building the house up, right? You've got the 8 and 4. 8 foot is almost the size of a person, isn't it? You'd be very tall, but it is very, very close to the size of a very tall person. Okay, so you have, I'll take away the 32 for now. So you have the foundation with the couplers, and then the people in the building, the 8 foot people, the adults, if you like. Now, the next layer up is the children. So 4 foot. Imagine a child at 4 feet. That's probably about right, isn't it, actually? So now we have the foundation, pedal, and people in the house. And then we can add some lights to it. Let's add some light to this house because it is a bit dark. Let's put on some nice 2 feet stops. There's the lights have come on. Then we have, what I was saying earlier about the swell crescendo, let's go down the sort of the French route of adding the reeds first. Okay, so we're going to add the roof. Imagine the rain hammering down on this metal roof, and it's sounding really quite barbaric. Okay, so that's the roof there. Level up, this is ridiculous, isn't it? The next level up is, but you got the roof on, it's the sky. Okay, so imagine it's either starry sky or you've got the sun, and these are the mixtures. So the bright sound. And that's a whole house with the scenery around it. That's, to my ear, that's how I hear it. All these layers building on each other. I mentioned earlier about so I'm going to get a little bit personal now about how I do it, and this is my. I suppose this is really why you've tuned in. Really, what I do. Now I mentioned earlier about adding diapasons to flutes. There are two schools of thought. You don't tend to combine them, or you do combine them. I'm in the latter school. I like to combine them together, and you can really mix them around to find that perfect sound. Okay, this is a caveat which I should have said earlier on. Actually, organ registration is a very personal thing. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's quite simple. It's a very personal thing. So you guys would probably choose different stops, but you think it would sound perfectly good, whereas I would use something else which I would find sounds perfectly good. It's a very personal thing. So on the swell we have one diapason, or one praestant, that one there. And a beautiful clear sound it is as well. We could, however, manipulate a second one. So how about, a diapason is a really clear sort of a stringy sound, isn't it? It's a warm, rich sound. You have a flute which is quite can be quite woolly and round in its delivery. Do you see what I mean? Quite a round sound with like sort of round edges, if you like. But diapason is a bit more rectangular and square and straight to the point. A bit more defined, you might say. Now on this organ, on most organs, to complement the swell string, that one, you will often have a solitional or a dulciana or something, which is essentially a quiet diapason. It's a wooden stop. It's actually string. By itself it sounds okay. But then you add this one, and that's basically like a solitional, as I say. And a solitional is almost like a small diapason. So that's the viol de gamba with the box wide open, the praestant with the box closed. Okay, so how about we add the smaller diapason, because it would be too small to use by itself. It wouldn't match the chorus, it would get drowned out very quickly. How about we add that? So add the defined rectangular diapason sound to one of those round fluty sounds, those woolly sounds, the flute. Okay, let's add the this one to it. Let's try the other flute. So in a way you can manipulate other stops to make, stops to make a certain sound. So that's how I achieve an almost a quieter diapason. I use the viol de gamba along with the flute. So that's an example of sort of using an open diapason sound with the flute to create another sounding stop. The flute by itself with the diapason. I mean, why would you not combine them? So if you want to combine them, please do. It adds weight, and as I was saying earlier on, I like to have a bit of weight in my organ sound. It's a very sort of Victorian thing to do in this country, a very fat sound. But then we can then if we bring on the sort of the fake quieter diapason on the swell, bring it down to the choir. and have the quiet solo G'dact, which actually is playable on the choir manual, confusingly. So what we have there is two flutes and that quiet viola gamba. If you bring the swell actual diapason into the mix, instantly have that really warm sound. And all I'm using there is just a few stops, the solo 8-foot and then the swell foundation stops. To my ears, that sounds just so delightful, and I could play hymns on that. But then we can build on that. So we have this really rather quiet, diapason-y sort of foundation, this bed, but then we need to build on it. And how do we do that? Well, we've got more flutes to use, certainly. Let's couple everything to the great, okay? So swell and choir. You barely even heard it come to the great, did you? The next sort of quietest stop on this organ is the choir 8-foot, this one here. It's beautiful, beautifully clear. So here we go. And already these flutes and one diapason on the swell is not sounding messy at all. Sounding warm and rich. Now, what we could do then is bring on the great 8-foot flute. So that's basically the only swell diapason and the three flutes, the solo flutes, the choir flute and the great flute. Inspiring sound that. So we've created the bed there, but then let's give that bed a bit more support. So how about we take off? Let's leave everything on. Let's add the great, the great diapason. It's still sounding extremely clear. Let's remove the great diapason and add this choir diapason, my favourite stop. Yeah, it's really working really, really nicely. So my advice to you with the registration at this point is combine 8-foot diapasons and flutes. This is now every single 8-foot on the organ, apart from the celeste and the quint, with the foundation. If your organ was loud enough, that would lead a congregation really well, I think. You have the pedal foundation driving it and this really warm and rich sound in the manuals. When you get to 4-foot, it just becomes a little bit more complicated. This is where I would say you probably don't want to be combining 4-foot flutes with 4-foot principals, because the harmonics on them, the clarity of a 4-foot is actually, it's a bit more clear and more defined than an 8-foot, okay? So I would, at this point, if I was wanting to build up that crescendo, I would stick with the diapason, the praesence, the principal sound. So I'm very happy with the 8-foot sound, even though it's them all. I love that sound so much. That's the 4-foot principal. But where do we go from there? Well, the next 4 foot on this organ, which, so we're not even thinking about 2 feet yet, or mixtures. We want to build on this sound. There's a particularly nice 4 foot on this choir. And then we can even bring on the 4 foot on the grate if you want to. And then at this point, we then think, okay, so we've got the 4 foot stops on. We then need to go into the 2 foot territory. At this point, you could then go into the mixtures as well. I think you at this stage ought to go into this organ, particularly Rotterdam, and it does it really well. Go from the 4 foot into the quiet into the quiet mixture on the grate. This one here. With the 2 foot if you like. Really, really wonderful sound indeed. I'm probably waffling on, and you probably know all of this stuff, okay, but some people won't appreciate how a crescendo is built. Okay, so then we have mixtures and then the reeds. I always start. So we're at the stage now where we might want to bring in the reeds. Okay, if we were playing French music, we would already have the reeds on, particularly the oboe and then the trumpet probably. So at this point, though, if you imagine playing, English music or anything else, it needs a bit more sort of gravitas about it. So let's add the swell. The swell, not the trumpets. We have to go to the swell first because they're quieter than the great ones. And incidentally, the choir reeds, there were quite a few down on that lower division. They're solo stops. They're not really voiced for blending within the chorus. You can bring them into the chorus at climatic moments for effect, but as a general crescendo, you want to stick with the swell and the grate. Okay. Now I bring on the swell reeds at this point, not only because they're quieter than the grate reeds, but you can also use the swell box to control them. Right. So if I play this chord of C major, I'll hold the chord down, then add on the swell reeds with the box open. Certainly hear them coming on, don't you? Now, if I play that same chord with the box closed, you can just about hear that 16 foot come on, only because it's like an octave down. But you're not really aware. And if the harmony was moving, if you're playing faster notes rather than just one static chord, you wouldn't necessarily be aware that it's come on. It just appears in the chorus. Now, I mentioned the swell box. It's so important, so important when crescendoing your registration to use the swell box. Use it like mad. Okay, so you might have at this point. Let's just imagine that we've we're playing something and we've got on the swell. We have the 2 foot and the mixture. Okay, we have that on as well. So it's like this. Nice sound, okay. But you want to add the swell reeds. So the swell mixture is quite loud. Close the box. And then all of that becomes quieter than the grate. Open the box. And that swell swell sound brings the chorus alive on the grate. But you want to add the reeds. Okay, so, and we're already, it seems counterintuitive. If we're crescendoing, by adding more stops to close the box. We don't want to close the box, we want to keep it open to add more sound, right? No, you don't. You want to close the box. You want to close the box to bring on the swell reeds and then bring the box back open, because otherwise you end up with that big crash of the reeds coming on all of a sudden, and it ruins that very smooth trajectory of crescendo. It suddenly sort of goes very smooth, upright, and then like that. You don't want to do that at all. So you want to, let's just have a quick go, shall we? So if you close the box before bringing on those reeds, you can then bring the box open, then you can really feel and hear that a swell growl from the swell reeds. It's very, very exciting indeed. So you need to have one of the feet on the swell pedal at all times, basically. Something that you may not have thought about actually when crescendoing and diminuendoing is, you know, in a 4/4 bar, for example, beats 1 and 3 are the strongest beats. In a 3/4 bar, beat 1 is the strongest, 2 is weaker, and 3 is the weakest. Okay, that's basically common sense, isn't it? Beat 1 in the bar is always the strongest. So I ask you a question, and it's a rhetorical question because you can't answer it because I can't hear you. Why would you add more stops, therefore getting louder, on a weak beat of a bar, which would therefore emphasize beat 2, for example? To me, that doesn't seem to make sense. So one of the things that I learned from experience and from watching other people is you add stops to the best you can. Sometimes it's not always possible, but you add stops on the strong beats of the bar. All right. Sometimes in music, you know, you'll have a phrase mark and you can add a stop at the phrase mark. But don't be so reliant on finding those phrase marks to add stops, okay? Don't be afraid to add stops in the middle of a phrase. Howls, I'll play Howls later on. I'll finish with Howls Rhapsody number 1 because there's a wonderful crescendo in that. Don't be afraid to add stops mid-phrase on strong beats where the harmony is changing. Similarly, on the way down, if you're decrescendoing, you take stops off on the weak beats. All right? It seems to make sense if you think about it, because the sound, you have a strong beat, a loud sound on beat 1. You take off some stops. Beat 2 is a quieter beat. The organ is then suddenly a bit quieter. And then beat 4, it then is quieter again. Beat 1 of the next bar is the loud volume, and so on and so on. So add stops on strong beats, take stops off on the weak beats. What I'd like to do is actually just play a piece of Elgar, just to see if I can demonstrate this crescendo to you. So what I will do is I will start. I have to start this piece on the swell strings. There's no other way, is there? You have to start on the swell strings. So just with a 16 foot on the pedal, I'm going to couple the strings to the pedal. And then what we're going to then do is go down to the choir division. I'm actually going to use a solo Gedacht, this one. I'm going to couple that to the swell. And then I'm going to take the swell and the grate, sorry, the swell and the choir and the solo to the great. So when I'm playing on the great manual, the middle manual here, everything is coupled together and playing. And then there's a big crescendo towards the end. And let's see how we can manage that crescendo. I can't promise it'll be perfect because it's live and unrehearsed. But watch on the screen to see what I do with this. It might have been quite hard to see, but what I was doing on the certainly on the decrescendo was taking stops off on the. You could almost count this in quavers. I was taking stops off on the second quaver, so the weak quaver, So like 1 and 2 and 3 and so on. So rather than taking the stops off on the first quaver, it's the second group of quavers. Actually, that solo A flat is actually scored in here for a tuba with the box closed. Alas, we don't have one of those, so you had the loud enchimade. Okay, I think actually at this point we should bring Caroline's microphone up, and I'll happily answer, as the best I can, any questions. So, Caroline.
Hello.
What have people been saying?
Well, yeah, they're enjoying it very much. A lot of people have had some good tips. Yes, apparently we're in Organist Review this edition. Beauty and Sound.
Wow.
Just for interest.
I'll have to find that out. Thank you. I didn't know that.
So I think some of the questions, so Sverre, Gerda and Eddie were looking at general principles of registration. I think you've covered that very well. And then we had questions about a nice smooth crescendo using divisionals, which you've covered nicely. How to crescendo diminuendo without divisionals, with just using the stops, which you've covered. So James had an interesting question. How can you create colours without a very big variety of stops if you're playing quite a small organ?
Well, I mentioned that earlier, creating a second diapason on the swell on this organ. So using the quiet flute and the essentially what is called a solitional. So that's how you might create a diapason, flute and a solitional. This organ, this is a great example actually of an organ which doesn't have a surgeon stop. This doesn't have an oboe. I've said this before, it's much to my great dismay that this organ does not have an oboe. I think otherwise it would be the perfect organ or a tuba. But you could possibly, let's have a listen to this. So this is the trumpet. Definitely not an oboe, is it? It's very, very loud, very bright. Now we can add things to it to try and manipulate it into a rounder, more delicate sound. So obviously you have to close the box a bit. Let's add something to it just to take the edge off. Let's try a few things. Let's try a 4-foot flute. It still sounds very trumpet-like, doesn't it? Let's try something radical and bring on the nasard. Well, it's called something else on this organ. So without it, and with it. How about something on the foundation? Perhaps the quiet, the viola da gamba. Doesn't really do much. Not too far off. So you'll never be able to find, if you haven't got an oboe, you'll never be able to magic one out of nowhere. But with the box closed, with the additional flute 8 and 4, and with the mutation there, you've actually got a rather smoother trumpet. If you haven't got a cornet stop, you can. I don't know whether there's. We'll talk about mutations a bit later, but you can also manipulate a cornet as well. So a cornet is made up of an 8.
Actually, Maffa asks this very question. If you don't have a cornet, what are your alternatives?
Well, there we go. So I'll build you a cornet, okay? So a cornet is made up of the following stops. It's made up of an 8-foot. It's made up of a 4-foot. It's made up of a 2 2/3. It's made up of a 2-foot and it's made up of a 1 1/3, a larigo. Let's see how that compares to the real cornet on this organ. You can also do the same thing on the swell. We have all the same stops. So 8, 4, 2 2/3, 2 foot, and that's not quite the right stop there. In fact, I haven't got anything to control. I can't. The stop above the one I'm pulling out, I can't control it because I haven't got enough physical stops. So there are ways around it.
Right. Ian has asked, obviously this isn't relevant for a pipe organ, but when you're playing a Hauptwerk instrument, is it acceptable for a Hauptwerk organist to revoice individual stops? Or is this not being authentic enough?
Well, you have to ask yourself the question, what are you trying to achieve by using Hauptwerk? Are you trying to just simply be as authentic and faithful to the original organ as possible? Or are you simply using the organ for your own enjoyment, for your own performance, your own practice? If you are using the organ as faithfully as possible, and you are, you didn't want to change a single thing, then you wouldn't want to revoice anything because you are essentially changing the character and personality of the organ. If, however, like me, you're not necessarily trying to replicate that organ, because quite simply you're not going to be able to replicate it. Hauptwerk does a very good job at mimicking, replicating an actual organ, but it's not the actual organ. You hear it in your living room or through your headphones or through your speakers, you're hearing a recording of the organ. It's not going to be the same. The only way you can actually hear the real organ is by being in the actual church or venue, wherever it is. So what I've done on this organ actually, and I said this in my video, my top 10 Hauptwerk organs in my fleet, I have manipulated some stops on this very organ indeed. The quieter stop, which is on the screen right now, the trompeter Betala, I have actually toned the volume down. Okay, so actually it's quite a fiery reed normally. It's quite similar to the big one. You can just it feels just like a little bit more distant. This one, it's right in your face, but this one, it's a few steps back, isn't it? It's just the edge has been taken off. I've revoiced that one just to try and get that. I didn't see the point of having two really in-your-face 8-foot on Chamard reeds. It's very nice to have, but it's rather greedy and unnecessary. So I revoiced the smaller one to be more, well, in my mind I was trying to get a tuba, but I couldn't get a tuba, so I settled with almost a trumpet sort of a sound. So I think, yes, go for it. I've also turned up the turned up that because I love it. I find it really exciting. And basically the comments I get on the videos are all generally positive. They think it sounds terrific, and the questions I get is, how do I get my organ sounding like I do? It's not just because I install the organ and then leave it as faithful as possible. I play around with it and try to find that balance of sound that I like, whilst trying to emulate the actual sound of being in the cathedral or in the church. So yes, please do mimic away, manipulate away, should I say.
Great. Jerry has asked, what is your recommended use for sub and super octave couplers?
I didn't mention that, did I?
And are there any unexpected opportunities where you could use a sub super octave coupler?
They're wonderful inventions. They're wonderful inventions. Basically, you've got an entirely new organ with the help of the octaves. on this organ in real life, so back to the original question, the previous question, if you're being authentic, you wouldn't use the octave couplers, but on Hauptwerk, and actually you wouldn't even use the divisionals because there aren't any. But on the Hauptwerk you've got divisionals and you've also got octave couplers and all sorts of other cheeky things. So an octave coupler, for those who don't know, I'm just going to pull out one stop on the swell, play that C there. With an octave coupler, all it's doing is playing that note. See? So immediately you have an 8 and 4 foot. Using one stop. If I add a 4 foot with the octave on, you have an 8-4 and a 2 because it's coupled upwards. Now the benefit of being able to do that is you are able to use 8 foot stops at 4 foot pitch, where otherwise you wouldn't have that 4 foot pitch. Do you know what I mean, Jerry? I think you do. So if you have this this middle C here, the only way to achieve the C above is either play it there or couple the 4 foot flute. And as you can hear, that's a rather bigger sound. However, you then instantly have a quieter 4 foot flute. You can do it with the strings, obviously, to create that really exciting, shimmering sound with the foundation. Of course, the only problem is with it, when you get so high, there are no more pipes left. So you have to be careful around that. So yes, it's quite common actually. I haven't got a unison off set up, but you could have the 16 foot on the swell, up the octave with the unison off, and instantly have another 4 foot, another 8 foot. Sorry. I actually have them set up on all divisions, so great. So that's the just one stop with the great octave. And I also have it on the choir, so you can really add that sound that I like so much, that foundation sound of 8 foot, then add the couplers, add the super octave to take all those 8 foots to 4 foot as well, and it creates a really wonderful sound.
Thank you. Peter, aka Good Chappie, says, is there any point in a swell unison off?
Well, that's directly related to what we were just talking about with Jerry's question. So if we had this excuse me, this 16 foot, I haven't got one set up so I can't demonstrate it, but if I had the super octave, so what you have in there, Good Chappie, is essentially 16 and 8. If you had the unison off, it would take away the 16 and basically create that stop into an 8 foot only. So you could have this 16 foot and that 8 foot. Put on the super octave, add the unison off, that 16 and 8 foot becomes 8 and 4 foot. Similarly, you could add a 2 foot and a 4 foot, add the sub octave, unison off, that 2 and 4 becomes 4 and 8. Similar reason to Jerry's question, you can really find new sounds and create an entirely new organ by doing that. If you have a 16 foot reed, like this regal down here, you could add the octave, which I haven't got set up, plus the unison off, and that 16 foot becomes an 8 foot. So yes, I do use unison offs quite a lot out in the real world on cathedral organs.
Right, I think we will use a sort of a musical demonstration for the next question. Francesco says, how would you register for Bach chorale preludes on romantic organs? And he said in particular solo voices and the use of tremulant and reed.
Well, I think you should... oh, thank you. I've just been handed the Orgel Buchlein here. I think what you should never try to make an organ do something that it simply cannot do. If you have a romantic organ, let's just say, for example, you have a very fine original Willis organ here in the UK, which you might have 2 manuals. You might have the wonderful Willis 8 and 4 foot stops, a mixture, and then you might have a great reed and inevitably a great big whopping pedal 16 foot reed. It's not going to be authentic for Bach, is it? So you should never try to force an organ to do something it should not do. With reeds and tremulants, yes, I do. I use, I often ask myself and ask other people, what would Bach do if Bach was here today and he was able to come and play some of these wonderful organs that we have access to? Do you really think that he would just dismiss all of the stops that he didn't have back in his day, and he would just only use the stops that he recognised? Of course he would not. He would absolutely pull out the reeds, the mutations, the mixtures, pull everything together. He would have a whale of a time. The tremulants, the octaves, the couplers, and I think it would really invigorate, and I think he would write for those sounds. So, for example, let's just have a listen to Ich ruf zu dir, Herr Jesu Christ. Let's use a reed plus tremulant, shall we? So the swell trumpet, the swell reed. In fact, let's find that fake oboe sound that we had earlier with the tremulant, and then what we'll have is the solo 8 foot flute, because it's so beautiful, 16 foot pedal, and we'll couple that solo flute down to the pedal, and we'll control the reed with the box. Let's see what this sounds like. This is not something necessarily that Bach would have recognised, but it is something that you and I might think is really rather beautiful. You sort of find I do play that piece on that sort of registration actually with the trumpet. I probably wouldn't use the that sort of combination of sound actually. I would probably use 8, 4, 2 and Nazar down on the choir with one of the swell flutes, I think. Or there's the option of using just quite simply the choir 8 foot praestant. I think if it sounds good to you, if that solo stop sings, if it has a certain clarity about it, then use it. I'm sure Bach would approve.
Great. I'm going to address mutations now. We've had quite a few questions about mutations. I know you've spoken of them already, but so Jim wanted to know, can you use a mutation with a mixture?
can you?
Or should you? I think should they was his question.
Okay, so so the mutations on this organ. So let's try them out. So the great ones up to the quiet great mixture. Okay, so that's the sort of the two quieter mixtures. The chirp is really rather massive. Now let's add some mutations into that chorus, shall we? Let's use the swell mutations. So and let's couple those down to some of the choir mutations. Doesn't sound entirely pleasant, does it? Let's just try putting that into the chorus. To my ears, the mutations don't sit well in the chorus. You'll often see me using mutations in the chorus, but I will only tend to use the nasards in the chorus. So the question you asked me was, can you use the mutations with the mixtures? I would say yes, but with extreme caution. I wouldn't use the TS or the Larigo. I would only bring in the nasard. It really depends on the sound of the organ. To my ear, those higher ones, the nasards, sorry, the Larigos and the TS, just great against the mixtures. So I would stick with mixtures plus the nasard if you really have to. There's no reason why you shouldn't. If it sounds good, then use it. If it doesn't sound good, do not use it.
And that leads us nicely onto Alessandro's question. Actually, are there particular situations that call for some mutations, e.g., a Larigo, rather than others, e.g., a TS? You've just said it probably it depends on how it sounds on that organ at the time for that piece.
I think a composer will often ask for a certain combination of stops, but I think it's actually down to you. If the solo in question goes low in the register, we have to be careful with the mutations, because then you actually... The great thing about a mutation is you don't necessarily hear the pitch when you're playing fairly high. All you hear is a colour. You don't necessarily hear the pitch, right? I will give £1,000 to anyone who can hear all of the pitches there. But if you go low down, oh yes, you can hear them all. It sounds odd, doesn't it? So if you are playing low solos, no, I really wouldn't. Let's just try that. So if you're playing low solos, I would use the higher mutations because they're higher pitched, and therefore there's less chance of being able to identify the actual pitch. Bearing in mind a Larigo is 2 octaves plus a fifth, and a tierce is 2 octaves plus a third. We haven't got a tierce on this organ. So 2 octaves higher makes it more bearable if you're playing lower down. If you're just using a nasard, this one here, which is 1 octave plus a fifth, you're more likely to hear that fifth. Okay, so I would say it might depend on the actual pitch of where you were playing the solo.
The next question is related to a piece by Graham Twist, who's in the chat. Chris wanted to know, how did you register his Toccata Giacosa? He really liked what you were doing on the top manual. That's the swell, isn't it?
Well, thank you. And I can't remember, to be honest. I think so. Do you mean if you mean the opening of that particular piece? It was just the full swell, but without the 16 foot. It might have been with. I can't remember whether they had the 4 foot reed or not, but it was definitely the mixture. So this is without the reed, but this is with the 8 foot and the 4 foot. I know I said earlier I don't tend to do it. That works for me. So 8 foot all the way up to mixture. So the principal chorus with the swell 8 foot reed. Bearing in mind the swell 8 foot reed is quite powerful on this organ, and then going down to the great, I think probably the two mixtures. So I think that's basically all I had. As you can see on the screen, what I had there. I think that was what I used. I can't quite remember, to be honest.
It certainly sounds familiar.
Yeah.
And Ronnie, one of your patrons, has asked,
Hi, Ronnie.
how do you do a trumpet tune changing between a solo trumpet and full organ? I think his question probably means if you've got a small organ, I guess, a 2-manual organ.
A trumpet tune,
so you haven't got the luxury of a solo manual, I would guess.
Well, let's just take the Jeremiah Clark as an example, shall we? It's one that you'll hear at weddings. It's the one that goes. It's that one. Imagine that you've only got 2 manuals. So on this organ, let's just ignore the bottom manual and let's just use the great and the swell. So 2-manual organ. The piece starts with trumpet solo, obviously. So we'll use the great trumpet. And then we'll pull on the swell foundation. I'm going to use all of them. And I'm going to take that up to, I would probably, on this organ, I'd take it all the way up to mixture and have the box shut. If you didn't have a box, I would take the mixture off and just have this sound. That's actually, the balance isn't quite right, is it? So you take off the 2 foot. Now the problem is when we come into the next section, which is actually a reprise of the opening, you could either just have some pedal stops with the swell couple, so you've essentially got this the great reed pulled out all the time, so then you do this and then go up to the swell here. But it doesn't sound very thrilling, does it? It doesn't sound very exciting. So what I would do in this situation, I would bring out some additional armory with the great reed. I would probably bring out 8 and 4. I would also couple the swell to the great. So actually, that the great reed is accompanied with the swell coupler and the great 8, 8 and 4. Does that make sense? The good news is you can still hear the trumpet. And then what I would, so when I would get to the sort of the recap, the reprise of the opening, which is on full organ, you then just knock off the great reed and possibly add the mixture instead. Let's just try that, shall we? so on. So yeah, you have to make do with what you've got, don't you, on these smaller 2-manual organs. I hope that helps.
Great. Stephen, when do you use or not use 16-foot stops in Bach prelude and fugues?
On the pedal or and great, presumably. Well, it depends what you're playing, doesn't it? Let's think of a good example, shall we? So, Caroline, can you pass me my book 5, please? From there. It depends on the texture. If there's lots of notes, you wouldn't use a big fat sound on a trio sonata. But let's have a think about something else. Let's think about, let me give you some examples. Let's just have a look at this E minor wedge, the 5-4-8. So we'll build up the chorus on all manuals. So we'll start with the swell, so 8 and 4. We'll have the mixture, and we'll have the 2-foot for good measure. Got the great prepared already. I will have the second mixture, and I will have also on the choir 8, 4, 2, and mixture. Now I would basically change my mind from time to time what I would use. Would I bring the choir to the great? I think it sounds wonderful if you do, or would you leave the choir off the great? Let's just, for this example, let's leave it on. Okay, so this is the opening of the prelude in E minor without a 16-foot. Now we've got two 16-foots that we could potentially use on this organ. We have the great, rather large Prästant, and we have the 16-foot on this swell, which is a 16-foot flute. I'm going to instantly go towards the swell one here, although I might not. I'm going to try the great first, because with it being a diapason, it has that clear, defined sound. Let's try that. Let's try the quieter one on the swell instead. That sounds rather effective. I think I would probably use the swell 16-foot. Later on in the piece, we go into sort of the next section, if you like, where I like to change manuals. So this is from bar 49. And I think that the quieter section, the more delicate section, doesn't want a 16-foot because it would muddy the waters. I'll show you what I mean. So we'll have the quieter section with the 16-foot. Try that again, but without the 16-foot. In fact, without the swell coupled at all to the choir. So I don't like the 16 foot in this quiet section, so I would not use it at all. I like to have the contrast between this really grand statement of this wonderfully strong E minor prelude and then the quieter section. You could even knock off the choir mixture. So when you go back up to the main manual, you have the great mixtures on and the swell mixtures, and it's a real contrast. With the fugue, definitely not. Definitely not. Because fugues are very delicate. Fugues are very intricate and well written, and it requires a lot of skill to write a fugue on this level. So you don't want to muddy the polyphony. So knock off the 16. So later on, when you have everything going on at the same time, it's nice and clear. So the conclusion to your question there is use the 16 foot in these grand movements. I'm thinking instantly of B minor as well, C minor, those big C minor chords at the beginning. That E minor works really well. Don't use it in something like this though. Or even this one. Because you've got that, it's almost like a recitative, isn't it? You've got that with those big, strong chords. You don't want to have a 16 foot there because it's a single line. Fugues, no, and I guess obviously trio sonatas, no. Chorales, it's often a single solo stop, so that's an obvious answer. So there you go. Long answer.
Right, we've got 3 more questions to ask. One of them is quite a quick one from Don. Did you keep the couplers on Rotterdam as original, or have you added any using the Hauptwerk master couplers?
Well, let's have a look at the screen. I'm going to press all the couplers on the organ, and hopefully they'll all correspond to what happens on the screen. I'll read them out loud. Swell to pedal. Yes. Great to pedal. Yes. Quiet to pedal. Yes. Swell to great. Yes. Choir and solo to great. Yes. Now the 2 of them there because the choir and solo are both played on the bottom manual. So that choir to great coupler there activates both solo and choir to great. So the answer is, as far as the physical buttons here are concerned, they all match up to what's on the real organ. However, I have cheated a little bit, and going back to Jerry's and Good Chappie's question with the super octaves, I've got the swell octaves on my launch pad, choir octaves, and also great octaves as well, just to make it sound even more amazing than it already does. So largely all the couplers that are on the original organ, and then super octaves in addition to those.
Next question comes from Paul. I think you've answered this actually. How do you change registrations without waiting for big gaps in the music without impacting on the notes that you're playing? So how have you managed to make it really smooth?
Well, if we think about hymns, a hymn is made up of harmony, and it tends to be block chords. Can you just pass me a hymn book and I'll open it on a random page. So if I was playing this particular hymn exactly as printed, it would sound just like this. exactly as all the notes on the page. But if I did this, would you notice much of a difference? And obviously the feet.
That looks very much like your cat technique to me when you have a cat in your lap.
So the trick is, as I said, a hymn is made up of harmony. It's very homophonic, okay? And you don't need to play all the notes written on the page as printed. As long as you're playing the harmony, that is fine. So you play the tune, obviously in the top part, and the pedal. So just those two parts together. Anything in between those two parts, you can basically do what you like. And some of you would have noticed in virtual church that when I'm getting excited, I tend to add notes on top of the melody. Actually, just play the chords a little bit like this. You could do this. Extra notes. So to answer your question, if you can do that, if you have a firm grasp of harmony and you know what the chords are, you can take the chords with your right hand or your left hand. You're freeing up a hand to grab a whole load of stops to add to that crescendo. So that's how you keep that sound flowing whilst crescendoing. You fill out the harmony with one of the hands.
Great, and we're just going to do one last question before your final piece. It's kind of a demonstration question, really. Ian would really like to see you describe the colours that you achieve in Elegy by George Thalben Ball.
Oh, what a piece it is! Beautiful piece indeed. One of my favourite pieces of English organ music. Thank you for asking that. Well, describe the sound. Well, let's have a look at what he asks for. Incidentally, these pink post-it notes are from when I played this in Say Cathedral in Normandy, down in France, on a wonderful cavaille. I've kept them in just for posterity. So when we get to the beginning, all he asks for, I've covered up his registration because I like to do it myself. He asked for swell, celeste, and lieblich. So that's basically strings and a quiet flute, great small diapason, quiet or solo, a viol, 8-foot flute, and tremulant. So basically, he's only asking for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops on the great. So let's have a look. So we've got the strings, swell. He's asking for a flute, so let's just use that one. He's asking for a small diapason on the great. Well, we've only got one diapason on the great. He's asking for on the choir. He's asking for the viol. We haven't really got one of those, so we'll use the diapason instead. And the flute with the tremulant. And the pedal stops as well. So this is what he's asked for. Now the problem with that is I actually like this this opening to be a bit warmer and a bit more full-bodied. And in the third bar, there's a diminuendo, and we can't necessarily do the diminuendo very easily without doing something quite dramatic, because that great diapason is rather large. So let's try adding a bit more foundation. He asks for a small diapason on the great. Let's just add the small diapason on the swell as well, along with the other flute. Let's keep the diapason on the great, but let's add the flute as well. And then as we go through that diminuendo, let's just head up to the swell division. In my ears, you know, if you imagine a string orchestra playing this, you'd have all of the strings playing the opening, very, very legato. Then going into, you know, you have this bit where it goes, and then you have this open fifth chord. The strings will just do that very gently and very easily, and they'll probably keep it fairly smooth and legato. So I want to try to achieve that sort of quality. So let's just try that. Let's just try that. So by doing that, we can keep the tempo flowing. There is a bit of a ridge, but we can keep it flowing. Now, this next section, he asks for a cello quality. Luckily, this organ has this diapason down on the choir, which has that cello quality about it. So you don't really need to do much to it. However, what I like to do in this section is actually really emphasize that cello quality. So I've got both of the 8-foot, the flute and the diapason on the choir. For good measure, I want to have this solo flute, and I want to take that to the great as well. So we have the choir, the solo, and the great 8-foots. Listen to this effect. So I actually just knocked off the swell diapason there, so it was just actually quite loud. So just take that one off, leave this. I probably would actually have a general there also to knock off the swell celeste. So we have this effect. So it really have that really warm, full-bodied sound in the left hand there. Going forwards onto the sort of the next section where he specifically asks for great diapasons with the swell. Yeah, so I would have them all together. So all of the 8-foots, possibly with the if we had some general setup, we could probably have the swell octave. For good measure, let's just see what it sounds like. Let's have the great octave as well. With the foundation, so I'm going to have a 32-foot flue, and I'm just for today I'm going to have the swell 16-foot flue as well. Sound. I hope you agree, and I think that if you heard that in an English cathedral, you would think, wow, that sounds really, really effective. The next bit, he asks for full swell and a great reed. It's actually covered by a pink post-it note, so I can't quite see. I think it says that. It just says great. Okay, so he actually specifically asks for full swell. So this sound, probably without the mixture because it's quite big. Try a 4-foot reed, and let's bring on the great reed at this point. I'll just just realised why it sounds so bright. I've got the swell octaves still coupled. Let's try that again. He then asks the organist to come down to the grate and all manuals, so you need to make sure the trumpet's knocked off and the grate to pedal is added. Then I would add stops there because A, the harmony changes, and B, it's the first beat of the first beat, so it's a strong beat, so you add a mixture. With the grate mixture. To bring the reeds out of the swell box, then you just do your crescendo through that point, and then the diminuendo as well. Hope that answers your question. I hope so. It's a wonderful piece, that, isn't it? A really wonderful piece.
So apologies to any of you who we didn't quite have time to answer all the questions, but I think the questions we didn't answer have pretty much been covered very comprehensively by Richard in his demonstration. That's the end of the questions.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you for your questions. What I will just do is I will end by playing this Rhapsody number 1 by Howell. This has a rather large crescendo. It starts very quietly, gets very, very loud in the middle, and ends very quietly. Okay, so what I'd like you to listen out for is when I'm adding stops, listen out for those strong beats of the bar, and listen out for harmonic chord changes. Basically, that's a good time to add it on a chord change or a different harmony. And then through the diminuendo, listen out for a steady tempo, because it's very, very easy for the tempo just to get slower and slower when you're taking off stops, because you're thinking about the registration rather than the tempo and the drive. So listen out for that, and then let's see how quiet we can get it at the very end. So this is the first Rhapsody by Howells, which you've probably heard me play already on my Herbert Howells organ album. Quick plug for that, go and check it out if you haven't heard it already. So I'm going to start with the swell strings. I am going to have one of the flutes with it as well. I'm going to have the quiet solo flutes down on the choir, coupled to the swell. I'm going to have all manuals coupled to the grate in preparation. And I'm also going to have the grate 8-foot flute by itself. Hopefully you can see what's going on the screen. So, Howell's first organ rhapsody. at the very end, on those wonderful chord of E flat minor in first inversion with the added ninth, or the second, you had the swell strings plus the swell octave. Something that isn't possible on the real organ because you haven't got that swell octave. Without the swell octave, it's just simply. This is nice enough, but add that extra shimmer with that octave. Really brings out that clash. Well, I do hope that has given you some insight into organ registration. If you'd like me to do a more condensed version of this video, then I will do a pre-recorded one and make it a little bit more coherent. There's a lot to talk about with regards to organ registration, a lot indeed. So I do hope that you've been able to take some useful information away. I'd be very interested to know what your thoughts are on organ registration, how you do it, and whether you have any different ideas to what I've demonstrated today. So thank you very much indeed for watching this evening. I hope that's been okay for you. Sorry it's gone on for a bit. Like I say, please do leave a comment, please do let me know your thoughts, and after you've done that, please do click like on the video. That really makes a difference to the video's success. So until tomorrow, virtual church, 5 o'clock normal time, we will both say cheerio, and I hope that you are all keeping well and staying safe. I do hope that you've appreciated the new glasses as well. I must admit it takes a bit of getting used to. It's funny because I put them on and everything seems clearer, but my eyes just take a little bit longer to almost focus. I don't know, it's odd. I think it's a phenomenon that I need to get used to. So until tomorrow, we'll say cheerio. Good night everyone, and stay safe. Goodbye.